Once upon a time there were two super cops named Bert and Marcus, who were really good at catching bad guys. But one day Mr. Bad Guy Frank D'Amico framed Bert, and Bert was charged with drug possession and sent to a prison. Prison was not Mr. Bert's natural habitat. So Bert developed a plan of his own. He trained for 5 years straight, and learned how to fight. When he was released he was ready. And he came back to Marcus, who visited him routinely in prison. And they developed a plan to hunt down Frank D'Amico and bring him to justice. They gathered firearms and knives and hired a wheelman, and searched up their local police station data bank for Frank D'Amico's whereabouts. They eventually found him and charged him for framing Bert. But Frank was resilient and pulled out a handgun and opened fire on the two. Marcus was shot in the head and killed, and the only survivor left was Bert. Bert ran for cover and clenched his teeth, angry that Marcus, his best and only friend through all his tough times, was murdered, and not only murdered, but murdered by Frank D'Amico, the man who sent him to prison for 5 years. Bert quickly pulled out his 257s and leaned out of cover. Frank continued firing, but he ran out of bullets in his clip, due to the surprise of being confronted after 5 years, and him being outnumbered. And not only outnumbered, but he murdered a police officer and had heat with Bert, whose face he recognized as if he seen a ghost. Bert took this opportunity of Frank's ceasefire and pulled out of cover completely and opened fire on Frank D'Amico, the notorious crime lord of Far Harbor. As Bert opened fire, Frank took 8 rounds to the torso, and 3 in his skull, and was immediately identified as deceased. Bert did it finally and avenges the death of his friend Marcus, who perished. And Bert knew the situation looked bad and not in his favor, so he took Marcus's body and put him in his car and left. Frank was left alone, and was not mourned when the time came. Frank sobbed a bit at the loss of his best friend and took Marcus out of the car, and sent him to the morgue the next day. The caretakers got a hold of Marcus's family and a funeral was held. Bert watched in the distance in disguise and knew he wanted to change society from its injustices like how he used to. But this time was different. This time he knew he would have to kill the criminals that wandered Far Harbor, lest a mistake would happen resulting in death, frame, rape, theft, family destruction, and inevitably hopelessness. So when Bert was home he was watching TV quietly on his couch and stumbled through a Cartoon Network. A show was uncalled, The Expendable, about a man that came back from the Vietnam War and began having mental disorders such as PTSD, and would snap at his loved ones when he was around them. And he would have to see a psychiatrist to control himself and calm him down. And he was greatly hindered and held down by the traumatic things he saw in the Vietnam War, from 1969 to 1972. And he became distant to his loved ones and was hard to be around. So Bert thought, he experienced pretty awful things himself, but wasn't a hindrance to his loved ones, unlike the man on the Expendables. So he thought he was fairly mentally tough and could handle the worst the world could throw at him. Specifically the death of his best friend Marcus, the other super cops. So he decided to develop an alter ego, a persona to stop the evil forces that threatened Far Harbor and picked on the weak and powerless, even helpless military veterans. So he made an outfit, and invested in companies around the city of Far Harbor and began helping the poor and disabled veterans by giving them food and a shelter, through his own company called Bert Cares. So Bert became known, and he knew this was the sort of distraction he needed, just in case someone thought he was snooping around. He said to himself, come on, the last one to be thought of as a vigilante would be the man helping the poor and needy. So he did this on the weekdays, when he could. But when the weekend came about, evil beware, Far Harbor's harbinger was here. He adopted the name Trauma Cop, as a memory from the Expendables, and the trauma he would bring to them in the process, instead of him receiving it. Unlike the weak and helpless and expendable man, and Marcus, Bert was inexpendable, and had an armory, and melee weapons and an armored vehicle, and was ready for the biggest turf wars Far Harbor could give him, at any cost. Introduction.